Lesbian Love in Prison, Part 4, Lesbian Love. The iron door slammed shut behind Mara with a sound that echoed through her chest like a gunshot. And in that single moment, she understood that the woman she had spent the last 3 months loving with every fragile piece of her broken soul was gone, transferred to another facility in the dead of night. Without warning, without goodbye, without even a folded note slipped, beneath the cracked door of cell Block D, the narrow cot where Diane had once slept still carried the faint impression of her body, and Mara stood in the doorway staring at it the way a person stares at the ocean after something precious has been swallowed by the waves, knowing it is gone, refusing to believe it, searching anyway. Mara had arrived at Lakeview Correctional 18 months ago, carrying nothing but a canvas, bag of secondhand clothes, and a sentence that felt longer than her entire life up to that point. She had been 27 years old, convicted of a financial fraud she had committed to pay her mother's medical bills, and she had walked through those gates with her jaw set and her eyes dry because she had promised herself she would not cry in front of strangers. She had kept that promise for exactly 4 days, until the silence of the facility at 2 a.m. broke. Something open inside her that she hadn't known was sealed. She had cried quietly into her pillow while her cellmate snored above her, grieving not just her freedom but the version of herself she had been forced to leave. Outside those walls, the daughter, the friend, the woman who used to walk barefoot in her backyard at dusk and feel something like peace. Diane had appeared in her life the way significant things often do, without announcement, without ceremony, wearing a faded blue jumpsuit and carrying a paperback copy of a Pablo Neruda collection that Mara had immediately recognized because she owned the same edition at home. Dog-eared and stained with coffee rings, they had been assigned to the same work detail in the facility's laundry room, and for the first week they barely spoke, communicating only in the language of shared glances and careful smiles, the kind of restrained kindness that people develop in places where vulnerability is treated as weakness. It was Diane who spoke first, sliding the Neruda book across the folding table one afternoon and pointing to a poem that Mara had always loved, the one about loving someone so intensely that even their silence carries a sound. Mara had looked up from the page and found Diane watching her with eyes that were dark and steady and impossibly gentle, and something inside her had shifted, not dramatically, not like the movies, but quietly, the way a compass needle adjusts when it finally finds north. What grew between them over the following weeks was not reckless or impulsive. It was the slowest, most careful love Mara had ever known, built in stolen hours during yard time and whispered conversations after lights out, in the passing of books and the sharing of the terrible coffee from the commissary and the occasional orange that Diane would split precisely in half with her thumbnail because she always insisted on fairness in everything. They were careful because they had to be. The guards were not all cruel, but the environment was unforgiving. And both women understood that what they were building existed in a space that the world around them had not given them permission to occupy. They built it anyway. They built it with the fierce, quiet determination of people who have already lost so much that they refuse to surrender the one thing that still makes them feel human. Mara had been the first to say the words, murmured one evening, when the sky outside the narrow recreation yard window had turned that particular shade of violet that she associated with autumn, with childhood, with every beautiful thing she had been separated from. She had not planned it. The words had simply arrived, honest and unstoppable, and Diane had gone, very still for a moment before she reached across the narrow space between them and pressed her hand over Mara's without speaking. And that silence had been the most complete answer Mara had ever received to any question she had ever asked. But Lakeview was not a place built for love. It was a place built for punishment, for order, for the management of human beings reduced to numbers and infractions and bed assignments. When a senior guard named Hollis began to notice the closeness between Mara and Diane, the atmosphere shifted in ways that were subtle at first. Extra scrutiny during work detail, separated seating assignments at meals, pointed comments designed to humiliate rather than correct. Hollis was the kind of person who mistook authority for ownership, who believed that the suffering of those beneath her was a privilege, she had earned with her uniform. She began to make Diane's life specifically difficult, assigning her the worst maintenance shifts, writing her up for minor infractions that other inmates committed daily without consequence, chipping away at her with the patience of someone who enjoyed the process. Diane had handled it with a grace that both inspired and terrified Mara, keeping her head down, absorbing the injustice with a composure that looked from the outside like calm, but that Mara knew, from their private conversations, was costing her enormously. They both knew that any visible resistance would only accelerate the outcome that Hollis was clearly working toward. So they endured, and they continued to find each other in the small hours in the quiet corners, and they continued to build their fragile, extraordinary thing in the margins of a world determined to erase it. The transfer happened on a Tuesday in November, in the middle of the night, with no notice given to Diane and no explanation offered to Mara or anyone else. Mara woke to the sound of movement in the corridor, and by the time she reached the door of her cell, the hallway was already empty, and the only evidence that Diane had ever existed in that space was the Neruda book left on the corridor floor, which Mara understood immediately was intentional, left behind because Diane had known in those final rushed minutes that Mara would find it, that she would understand what it meant, that the gesture was the only goodbye available to her. Mara sat on her cot with that book pressed against her chest for a very long time. The grief she felt was not the clean, acknowledged grief that the world makes space for. It was the kind of grief that has no formal name, that no one sends flowers for, that she could not explain to her family during visiting, hours without watching their faces, close off with discomfort or confusion. She grieved in isolation, the way so many women in that facility grieved everything, silently, invisibly in the margins of a system that had already decided their inner lives were irrelevant. But something else happened in the weeks that followed, something that surprised Mara with its arrival. The other women in her block, several of whom had quietly witnessed what existed between her and Diane, began to show up for her in small ways. An extra blanket appeared folded at the end of her cot. A woman named Portia, who had barely spoken to Mara in 18 months, began saving her a seat at breakfast and asking her opinion on things with the deliberate casualness of someone who wants to offer company without drawing attention to the fact that they are offering it. Another woman slipped a handwritten note under her door that said simply, "You are not alone in here," unsigned, written in careful block letters on a torn page from a notebook. These were not dramatic gestures. They were tiny, fragile, entirely human ones, and they accumulated inside, Mara-like light accumulates in a room when someone slowly raises the blinds. She began to write letters, not to Diane because she had no address, no information, no way to reach her, but to herself. Long, sprawling letters that she filled with everything she wanted to say, everything she remembered, everything she was afraid of losing. She wrote about the way Diane laughed at things she found genuinely funny, fully and without self-consciousness, a laugh that seemed incongruous with their surroundings and that Mara had always privately treasured because of that incongruity. She wrote about the Neruda poem and the orange split in half and the October evening when Diane had described her childhood home in Georgia, with such specific tenderness that Mara had been able to see it clearly: the porch, the fig tree in the backyard, the grandmother who made sweet potato pie from a recipe she refused to write down because she believed some things should be carried only in the hands and the memory. Writing became the practice that held Mara together. And in holding herself together, she began slowly, deliberately, painfully to imagine a future that extended beyond the walls of Lakeview. It was a future in which she would find Diane, or be found by her, in which the love they had built in the queue margins would be allowed to exist, somewhere with more room, more air, more dignity. She did not know if that future was realistic. She held on to it anyway, because hope in a place like that is not a luxury. It is a survival strategy. It is the most radical act available to a person who has had nearly everything taken from her. If you have ever loved someone in the face of a world that told you that love was wrong, if you have ever held on to something precious in conditions designed to make you let go, if you believe in the radical stubbornness of the human heart, then please take a moment right now to like this video and share it with someone who needs To be reminded that love survives, that it persists, that it does not require the world's permission. To be real and true and worth every sacrifice it demands. Mara still has the Neruda book. She keeps it beneath her pillow, and some nights she falls asleep with her hand resting on its cover, the way you might keep your hand over something sleeping that you are afraid will be gone when you wake. She has begun to believe in the specific quiet of those late hours, that love does not require presence to remain alive, that it lives in the way it has changed you, that Diane is somewhere beneath the same sky, perhaps also awake, perhaps also holding on to something small and ordinary that carries an enormous meaning. She does not know this for certain. She chooses to believe it anyway, because certainty has never been the foundation of love. Courage has always been. Before this story ends, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever loved someone in circumstances that the world made difficult? Have you ever held on when everything around you said to let go? Your story matters here. This is a space for it. Mara's story is not over. It is, in the truest sense, only just beginning, because she has decided, with the particular quiet ferocity of a woman who has survived what would have undone others, that when those gates open and she walks back into the world, she will not stop until she finds the woman who split an orange in half with her thumbnail and left a book of poetry on a cold corridor floor as the only farewell she was permitted to give. And whatever that reunion looks like, whatever the world says about it, whatever obstacles remain between here and that moment, it will be, without question, worth everything.